thanks so much for coming out. We have friends out tonight, and not exactly for eulogies, but to tell stories. And I was trying to think of the right tone to set by recalling some of Mike's favorite stories. And one favorite, which he used to say, we dined out on, was the one he clipped from me from the New York Times from 25 years ago, which I knew it was, I used to say, my friend Michael Uhlmann clipped this piece for me from the Metropolitan Diary of the New York Times, Sketches of Life in the City, recorded by witnesses. And the one that Mike clipped for me read in this way. It said, "Dear Diary, it was midway during Act 3 of La Traviata at the New York City Opera. And after witnessing Alfredo's confession of love, Violetta's rejection of the carefree life of Paris, their retreat to the countryside, but Georgia's appeal to release Alfredo for the benefit of his sister's prospects of marriage, her pretended compliance and deceit, Alfredo's jealous rage, her reversal, an illness, Giorgio's sympathy, the lovers' tragic reunion, and Violetta's death. After that, I heard the woman behind me say to her companion, the same thing happened to my girlfriend Gloria." Well, so I would say, we'd open that way, we'd say, well, I'm going to offer you the same blending of the grand and prosaic. But that's what our lives are, these mixtures of grand and prosaic. I want to thank you all for coming. Some have trekked in a long way. We've got Terry coming in from New Zealand, and we have Ryan and Charles coming in from the West Coast, Nick and Claire Curry coming in from Oxford, George O'Toole from Boston. This was not an invitation to the general public. We sought to bring in here people who've been touched by Mike in his friendship, his teaching, his moral seriousness, his humor. Alan Heslop said that we remember the mischievous wit, the deft interruption, and the robust laughter of a man at ease in the world. And he said that Mike also would express this sense of the moral erosion of the culture and say, we're doomed. And Al would say, no, he didn't mean it, he was an optimist. I said, he did mean it, he did mean it. I said, but it was an optimist, the kind of the style of Mike Novak's line about the Polish optimist and the pessimist, where the pessimist says, things can't get any worse. And the optimist says, oh, yes, they can. And that's Mike's kind of optimism. But I think he says we couldn't stop, we couldn't fail to make the argument. We still had to defend the argument, to defend moral truth and the American regime. And some of us here just we're doing this because some of us still haven't recovered from that sudden loss of Mike. And I realized, in part, we're doing this for the same reason I had for doing that long, extended dedication from him in Natural Rights and the Right to Choose, to tell the story because we had the sense that he wouldn't do it himself. Our friend Harry Jaffe used to say, at humility, I am tops. And humility was Mike's vice. I said in my piece, he was just maddeningly self-effacing. So in that dedication, I drew on that passage from All's Well that ends well, Bertram's father, famous in council, and they said of him, his honor, clock to itself, knew the true minute when exception bade him speak, and at that moment, his tongue obeyed his hand. That was Mike. Well, I took some soundings on this first. I want to see if Clarence was up for doing it, and Boyden. And Clarence and Boyden were really keen to do it. So I thought, okay, we can get everybody else into it. And I want to introduce the panel. But before I do, I want to take notice and take account of, and I'd be grateful for, the children over here. For Peter Uhlmann, for Becky and her husband Darren, and for Sarah. And we also have Mike's niece Sorelli and her husband Mark Cunningham and their son Quentin. Let me introduce the panel. We have with us the man who stands now as the senior justice on the Supreme Court in point of service, and a new movie star. I said, it's sort of like Gone with the Wind, and at the end, he tells Joe Biden, frankly, I don't give a damn. Something like that. You know, Gina sent me a note about the film, and at the same time told me we're sold out. Okay, so we expect.
They waited until they were sold out.
Right. And with us here with me too in this project was Boyden Gray, who probably knew Mike before any of the rest of us did, because he knew Mike when he was in prep school, because his brother was Mike's closest friend and his roommate at Yale. And of course, Biden worked with Mike on probably 2 transitions, right? We'll talk about that later. We have here Danny Bogg. Where's Danny? Over here. Oh, okay. Going to White House years. Danny Bogg. Dan worked with Mike in the Reagan White House, and his wife Judy did as well, right? Later on. Okay. And he just took senior status in the Sixth Circuit, and appointed now to succeed him is our dear friend John Bush from Kentucky as part of our project. We also have Charles Kesler, the editor-in-chief of the most notable literary political magazine in the country, the Claremont Review of Books, the best one, and a Bradley Fellow. And my dear pal, Ryan Williams, who's trekked in, who was a dear student of Mike's, who worked on a dissertation on the founder of this club, right? Former President and former Chief Justice Taft, now ascended to the presidency of the Claremont Group. And Matt Glover, a student Mike adored. To take that line from Henry James, Mike wanted to keep putting wind in his sails. He really adored Matt, and Matt went on to law school at Virginia, and now it's the Department of Justice. Right? Okay. We couldn't do this. I don't think we may try to make some chronological sense of how this thing unfolds, but I'd rather cut into this problem with Clarence, because he was so generous in giving up his time, carving out the time to be with us. And actually it was Mike with Ken Basugi who really alerted me to Clarence and urged me to get together with him years ago. And we were both speaking at a Heritage Fund, something at the Heritage Foundation. And I went in to sit in on Clarence's seminar. There was a nice gal introducing him, Laura Scalia, no relation to Nino. And she said, maybe next time we'll come back, you'll be on the Supreme Court. And Clarence says, that is not going to happen. And Laura came back and said, when you said it's not going to happen, do you know something we don't know, or was that just a throwaway line? And Clarence then, one of the most impressive, Clarence said, no, it's like this. I have colleagues who hear that they're on the short list, and that begins to work on them. They begin to look at these cases with a sense of how might this play at confirmation hearing. And I decided you could bend yourself wholly out of shape doing that. So I decided, these chambers are beautiful. This is an important vocation. I can spend my life learning how to do this well. I got home that night, I told Judy, this man he has his center of gravity. You could just throw crap at him, he'd still be there. And 3 weeks later, he was nominated. And they started throwing crap at you. Right. And he was nominated. Now, I would bring students every so often to the court for morning of oral argument. And we then visit with Nino Scalia or with Clarence. And Clarence was always so generous with his time. But this is where I wanted to cut in. Because one day, Mike came into the room as we were having the meeting. He walks in and Clarence says, there's the man who got me into all of this. And this is where you pick up the story.
Well, first of all, thank you, Hadley. And I feel actually not up to the task, and I'm deeply humbled even to be here. I met Mike in the Reagan administration. I think many of us did. and he was in domestic policy. I was at EEOC. And of course, I was never in trouble at EEOC, or is it I was never out of trouble at EEOC. So there were many meetings at the White House with Michael Horowitz, Mike Uhlmann, and you all can guess which of the two was the easygoing of the two. But I spent a lot of time in Mike's office in meetings. Well, when the Bush administration started, after President Bush was elected, something possessed me to write him a note and make some suggestions to the new president-elect about some of the things that maybe they could do that we didn't do in the Reagan administration. And he sent President Bush, who was just always very gracious, sent me a note back saying that he would pass it on and thank me. I thought that was good, and I thought that'd be the end of it. Well, at the beginning of the transition, I get a call from Mike to meet him for breakfast near the Washington Hilton. I assume that's where the transition offices were. And we met at a little restaurant, and he had followed up on those questions and asked about some of the personnel ideas I had. I made those suggestions. What are some of the policy positions that were problematic? And we spent the breakfast discussing those things. As we got up to leave, he asked, would you be interested in being a judge? And I said, not this lifetime. He said, would you want to discuss it? I said, no, I'm done with Washington and confirmations and things like that. And he said, would you at least discuss it with Ricky Silberman, Larry Silberman's wife?
Right.
And Ricky, of course, has since passed away, but I said, I will do that. So I went back and I talked to her, and she convinced me to talk to Larry. And Larry, to whom I said, Larry, I do not want a lifetime appointment. I cannot do a job for life. He said, Clarence, you can leave. It's not slavery. and
It dawned on you, huh?
Yeah, but Mike Uhlmann was the first to broach that idea, and to say that almost as though it was something you were obligated, not in a very sort of subdued and humble way. This is what you should do. Not that you are, not from an ambition, standpoint of ambition or career, but this is required of you. And I think I guess as a former seminarian, you're always looking for the next vocation. And those seeds were there and never to be removed. Yeah. And of course, Ricky, who knew how to push my buttons, and Ricky was a dear, dear friend. And she knew what was important to me. And she knew what I thought of Larry and this country. But before that, I think the groundwork had been done by Ken Masugi and John Marini, Bill Allen, all the Claremont crowd, all the trips we made to Claremont, about how important this republic is, how important this government is, and why this Constitution has to be enforced right, why the rule of law is important. So I think Mike came in not even knowing it. I mean, I met Charles. We were just laughing about sitting in his apartment when he was a new professor out in his small apartment listening to George Jones, and before we took a red eye back to the East Coast. But it's as though all of it was timed right, but it was Mike. And he never, you hear a lot of things. There are people who claim a lot of things in your life, and I never saw him claim anything. I never heard him say, I'm the guy who did this. I had to accuse him as Jacques Hughes. And I think you had it absolutely right. He walked in, there's the guy, take him, arrest him.
But that's interesting, because Mike is often Dr. No. Mike would always tell us why we couldn't do something. He was the voice of sobriety. Did he make the pitch as to why he thought this was your vocation?
No, not really, other than we had worked together And it's something similar to what Boyden would tell me years later. We had worked together, and I should do this. I mean, it was as though you are called to do this. Now, I'm the last to have been told about this call, but he was convinced of it. He was immovable about it, and he had never broached it. No one had ever mentioned this to me before. And this was the first anyone had ever mentioned it.
And what do you think got your sense of obligation got to you?
I think we are, it's really hard for me not to, it's hard for me to require things of others and not do them myself. I think that we still do, my wife, we still do wreaths across America. And you can't put wreaths on those graves over there without feeling that, asking yourself, what have I done? What have I contributed? And I think I never thought after the Reagan years that I certainly had contributed enough. We sent people off to wars. I just read this year E.B. Sledge's book, The Old Breed. And you cannot read that and see what this 19, 20-year-old kid's doing on Peleliu and Okinawa and come away thinking that I have done enough, and start feeling sorry for yourself. So you feel like I need to do more. But at any rate, at that time, I had a lot of battles at EEOC, but I still felt that, there is more to be done and that you're being called to do it. And it was as though Mike was that call. You're supposed to do this. It wasn't, again, he didn't say, this is for you career-wise, this is good for you, this will lead to that. It was as though this is what you are called to do. And he didn't say it in a mean way, he didn't say it in an aggressive way, but it was obviously true. And I've always taken it that way. I took it at that time and in retrospect, as he is a voice. And I'm one of these people. I happen to be still quite religious, and I do believe God acts in mysterious ways. And I believe he was working through him to tell me, this is your next step, because I had no plan. My plan was to become deputy director for management at OMB or something, and cleanse this EEOC years, and then go on into the private sector and make some money. That was it. There was a great plan. Not a lot of money, just enough to get by and mind my own business and live a private life. And it's interesting. I always say that my plans, God takes my plans as a joke, as a script. He's like laughing. He says, "You plan what?" Oh yeah, right. That's really funny.
Yeah.
But no, Mike, I think, was a voice, and I've always thought of it that way, and I've always wondered how he never stood up to take credit for anything.
Oh, that's right. That's right. And Thanksgiving, he'd be out painting walls for nuns, things like that. Yeah. But let's fill in. I'd hate to break that marvelous moment, but fill in one item in the story, because when you were at EEOC, you and Ken used to have a little reading group, didn't you, on political philosophy?
Well, Ken and John Marini and the guys, the Straussians, were probably the most influential in getting me started to understand what I do now. After I finished law school, of course, I was steeped in substantive due process and in doctrine of incorporation and things that made no sense to me. And we spent hours, literally hours, talking about those things. And then we'd fly out to California. We would spend time there. We would go to political science conventions and argue with Marxists. It was a lot of fun. And I was still running an agency, but I was a young guy. We'd read all this material. We'd give speeches. We'd give talks. We'd write articles. And it was just the beginning of understanding just why this government and why this is so important. And it has served me well because it allowed me not to start on the back end of things and look at the development of constitutional law, but to understand why this Constitution first. And once I got that, then later on, you could see how far we have deviated from what we originally had. And hence, that was when the whole idea of even being an originalist started. It didn't start afterward, after I got to the court. It started the hours, many hours that we spent, hundreds probably, reading and discussing things and traveling.
You were a real originalist in the sense of you read the Constitution against the Declaration, as Lincoln did.
Well, no, as Ken Masugi did.
Yeah, Lincoln got it from Masugi.
We got it from Masugi
right.
and Harry Jaffa.
Right. Listen, I neglected to mention, I did mean to mention that we're also joined by our dear friend, the sainted Jim Buckley, who's over here. And we're also joined by the AG, Bill, who just, good to see him. And this goes back to the White House years. I want to bring Bill into that discussion. So let's shift it over to Boyden, about a little bit how you got to know Mike Boyden, and maybe move from there into the transitions, or your sense of Mike during this period.
Well, he was the greatest teacher I ever had. Beginning with the first time I met him, I was going to visit my older brother at, I think he was 2 classes ahead of me, at Yale. And I don't know that he was trying to talk me into going to Yale because I was still in high school, but I think that may have been the point. But I didn't go until Saturday morning, and he'd gone to Morey's the night before and gotten utterly trashed and spent the entire weekend in bed. And so I was left to the tender mercies of Mike to entertain me. And my instincts and leanings were conservative. I'm from the South. I'm a Scottish heritage, and you couldn't not be somewhat conservative if you had an older brother like I did. But how much he learned from Mike is not clear to me, but a lot. But Mike provided the scaffolding for I mean, beginning then and thereafter. It was a great friendship. He was a great friend, and he was a great teacher. And then we had 2 transitions together. One was the Reagan transition, where we got the regulatory reform stuff worked out, the bare bones of the executive order and whatnot. And then the next one was the Bush transition, where again he was an enormously great mentor for me. I don't know what stories to tell, except I don't know whether Danny Boggs was involved in the transition, the Reagan transition regulatory group, but Ray Peck was another one, a guy named Fred Kaduri, of course Jim Miller, who was stated to be the first head of OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, for those who don't really get into the weeds here. He was very encouraging and encouraged me to write the first draft of this executive order, and it, of course, was passed around in justice and improved greatly over the course of the next 2 or 3 weeks. But I think it was Mike's idea to have the thing circulated for cabinet review. It's timely because we're in that period now. On the Friday afternoon of Washington's 3-day weekend holiday. It's classic Mike. And the responses were due Monday morning. And there wasn't a single cabinet officer who had a clue what they were looking at. And they were all at home anyway. And there were no general counsel yet even nominated or even acting. They were all, they were holdovers. And we bring him in on the next day. He got the cabinet to sign off on it on February, whatever it was, 20th or something like that. And the next day, Jim Miller called everybody into room 248 in the old executive office building, all the acting, holdover general counsel who were there, and said, here's the draft here's an executive order. He didn't say draft, here's an executive order we want you to review. And they started looking at the thing and flipping over pages, growling, and people scribbling and crossing things out. It was just by the time, after the first 10, it was just mayhem in there. And then faster ones got to the end and saw Reagan's signature at the bottom, and it was wonderful. It was one of the great treats of my life. But that was all Mike. That was all Mike. I mean, he was, and you could see the smile on his face at the cabinet meeting. He just was sitting there beaming, like, you know, that was wonderful.
But didn't you say that when you did the second transition, you and Mike were trying to arrange every appointment dealing with law?
Well, every single one, yes. And that's when, with all due respect to the AG, he came in, is that right? Yeah. It was much Mike's idea as anybody that we should put him in OLC and start him on what became a great career.
That's right.
But he had been, I'd gotten to know the Attorney General quite well through Mike and legal policy affairs of the Reagan administration. So I knew Bill from that period, and we spent a lot of time together doing regulatory stuff and other related things, and then of course, like a lot of things, you know, the people that you think you're helping outperform you, and then go into the stratosphere, never to be seen again. But anyway, no, I'm very, very proud of my association with Bill. But he did help. That was the way 41 wanted it. He gave me, you might want to say us, the authority to basically control every single legal job, every single general counsel, of course, all the stuff in the White House, and it was really terrific. I'm not sure whether Thornburg would have accepted on his own, would have nominated Bill Barr to be OLC, but we told him he was going to, and that's the way it happened. There was discussion early on about Justice Thomas and the D.C. Circuit. And then, of course, when the first opening came up, the president himself wanted it to go to Justice Thomas, the first opening. And Thornburg and I both said, no, maybe he's not quite ready yet, maybe he needs a little bit more seasoning, and I don't know. It was the right decision for you. It may not have been the right decision for the court, but it was the right decision for you because by then you really were ready, and you had totally convinced every single member of the court, and I don't know whether you were there at that time or not, but every single member of the court supported you, and we knew there'd be no surreptitious leaks out of the court saying this guy's not qualified. So that was but again, Uhlmann's fingerprints and presence were behind all of these things, and he, as I say, I just repeat, greatest teacher, mentor I ever had.
Let's fill one, it jumps ahead a bit, but just maybe fill one point. Mike was offered Bob Bork's spot on the D.C. Circuit, right? When Bob.
Well, I don't know. I was not.
Oh, I thought you were involved in that one.
No, I was not involved. I was Bush's counsel, but I wasn't involved in judicial selection then.
Oh, okay, but Mike for different.
You're talking about Reagan. I mean.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, that's true. Okay, this was about '87 when that failed. But when Mike backed out of it, who was it? Did Ray? Does that when you were appointed, Ray? Did you take that slot?
No, Ray was.
Was it you?
No, I was Bush.
No, he was Ray was Bush.
We're all Bush.
And Boyden's responsible. So.
Yeah, we're all Bush.
So who took that appointment when Mike declined it? You remember?
The Bork, I think, wasn't that Ginsburg, and then he got knocked out?
No, that was for the Supreme Court.
Oh,
That was the Supreme Court.
You're talking about the D.C. Circuit.
When Bob left the D.C. Circuit, that's when Mike. That's when Mike was.
No, I was not involved deeply enough to know.
For Bork's place.
No, that was later. That was for the circuit court. I have no idea.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
If only we hadn't turned off our cell phone.
Yeah, we could get the answer. All right.
Could have been Dave Sintel. Could have been Dave Sintel.
Oh, okay. Look, let's.
Who was it?
According to Wikipedia, it was Justice Thomas.
Oh,
That's what I thought.
I think it stayed open for a while and then took
That's
Yeah,
what I thought.
well, see, there you go.
They're
All
right.
right.
That's right. I
I
thought.
thought I took Nino's seal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
think.
First, I thought it was you.
I thought it was Bob. I thought it was Dave Santel.
Well,
Yeah, I thought it was you. Okay, let's shift
he's
it
broken
over.
Well, I
rules,
believe
but-
Wikipedia then.
Right. Wait, you were there.
Yeah.
You were there. Let's bring it back to when Mike came to town, when he was recruited by Senator Ruska to save what he called the Electrical College, and he wrote this impressive report. He wrote this impressive minority report. And Chris DeMuth did an interesting piece called The College of Uhlmann, and the effects of Mike's teaching then. Chris, do you want to recall some of that story about Mike and the Electoral College?
Well, I'll just say a few words. When Mike
Can I hear people here? Okay.
when Mike died, people were writing tributes, and there were several wonderful ones that came out in the first week. And I was asked to write something, and I wanted to kind of go beyond just personal appreciations and talk
Yeah.
about something that he had done that I regarded as a real monument, but I didn't know too much about it. I knew two things. One was that when in the 1970s, a mentor of mine, Edward C. Banfield,
Oh, yes.
had taken this Senate report and put it in my hands and said, the minority report is the best thing that has ever been written on the Electoral College. Sit down, my son, put everything aside, and read it. And it's going to take time because it's a difficult, complex essay. And I read it, and I thought it was wonderful, but it wasn't in the center of my interests, and it sort of went away. I got to know Mike in the public interest law world in the 1970s, and then we were down the hall in the Reagan the Eisenhower Executive Office building. And we were having lunch one day, and I asked him about that report. And the one thing he had to say was, one of the most gratifying things that ever happened to me was after that report came out, I got a call from Gene McCarthy's secretary saying that the senator wanted to meet with me. And I'm working for Roman Ruska. Why does he want to meet with me? and I was ushered into his office, and he said, young man, I understand you wrote this report. I want you to know that I have been a fervent advocate of direct popular election of the president all my life until last weekend. And I read this, and I'd never really thought about it, and now I understand it. And I'm an opponent, now suddenly, of this direct election amendment that's going to the floor. And that's all I had to go on. Now, Mike was not bragging, and I was sure he was telling the truth, but there was no paper trail, there was no evidence, there was no nothing. But I wanted to do this, and it was a detective story. I couldn't find any references to McCarthy until I found an old book from the mid-'70s by an advocate of abolishing the Electoral College that recounted what had happened in 1969 and 1970. And there's a little footnote that mentioned that 2 days before the vote, this letter arrived at every senator's desk from Sam Ervin and Eugene McCarthy opposing it. And in closing, a copy of the Senate report said, read this, we want every senator to vote against popular election of the president. And the McCarthy thing was just, it caused a huge stir. It made a very big difference. But where was this letter? This book, the person that wrote it is gone and so forth. And I found it in a file in the Sam J. Ervin Jr. archives at UNC Duke. And an intern went to the file and pulled the letter out, and I have it with me. So we had some real evidence of it. The report is what Mike wrote is quite wonderful, and Claremont Institute is going to be publishing it in pamphlet form sometime this year, along with several important essays that have been written afterwards. Martin Diamond, Herb Storing, Pat Moynihan gave a wonderful talk on the floor of the Senate that is an important addition to the Electoral College literature. But it really all goes back to the piece that Mike wrote as a 30-year-old, brand new junior bunny staffer for Senator Ruska in the heat of battle, when the Electoral College abolition had passed the House by an overwhelming majority with stronger Republican support than Democratic support. President Nixon had endorsed abolition of the Electoral College, had called on the Senate to follow the House's lead.
Wow.
30 of 38 states had peremptorily announced that send it to us, we will ratify it. And it had huge momentum. The labor unions, the Chamber of Commerce, everybody was behind this, and it was an impossible situation. And it's always hard to say exactly who causes something to go up or down in politics, but the most striking and influential thing that happened in the fall of 1970 was the Mike Uhlmann report.
Well, that's impressive. You know, one of the oddities of that report, looking back at it again, was that Mike he said, what would we do if somebody did win the popular vote but lost the Electoral College? He said, happily, that has not happened yet. And he said the Hayes-Tilden thing in 1876, and Blaine, and in 1888 with Grover Cleveland. He said, well, those things were really in doubt. So Mike had a mini crisis in 2000 with Bush, but the thing still holds, because the point was that even in a national election, you're trying to figure out what kind of basket of states you need, and that will require people to spend some time in their basket, in Iowa, as an example. And so Hillary Clinton is faulted for not spending enough time in Wisconsin. So you can see that it still works. And we realized that if it weren't there, it would be Iowa all over again, like Groundhog Day. Iowa all over again doing this stuff. Now, in 1970, we had a midterm election, and the late Phil, we had a race in the Senate and in New York, and the late Phil Nicolaides came up with the slogan, "Isn't it time that we had a senator?" This was the pitch for Jim Buckley. Okay. And Jim was there at a critical inflection point on that day in January 1973, when Ray and Lee's first son was born, and LBJ died, and the court announced a decision in Roe versus Wade.
Wow.
All right. The trifecta, right? Three things happen at once. And that launched something. So we had the Buckley Amendment. We had Mike rolling into action. Jim, do you recall into the story about how that moved and how that came about? Who took the initiative there? But it was Mike's. Mike wrote the amendment, and you had the guts to do it. All right. Human life. The human life and the reaction to Roe versus Wade.
When that case was
Take the mic, Jim.
when that case was decided, I was in France with the Senate group, and Mike sent me an urgent telegram and said, "We've got to do something about this." So I came back, and he then thought through how it should be crafted. It had a lot to do with the crafting, and we took it from there. And we managed to get lots of co-sponsorships. The Judiciary Committee was not very anxious to look at it, to consider it. It eventually did have some hearings, and I had to urge the clergy to go, and I mean any bishops not to wear their spectacular garments, but but in any event, it failed of adoption.
But were there Democratic senators supporting it at
Oh,
the
yes,
time?
very definitely.
See, there's a difference in the times, right? Who was supporting it on the Democratic side? Do you remember?
Eastland, I remember that.
Who? Eastland. All right. It's at that one.
Oh, my
Okay.
Lord. I think I told you earlier, I have no memory for
I-
anecdotes and so
Jim,
forth.
yeah, I'm losing names all over the layout. I use Victor Borge's line when he says, "My two sons, Peter and Peter." He said, "It doesn't matter. They never came when I called them anyway." All right. Now we've got. But you took the initiative, and I think it was Mike who did on the White House. I think didn't Mike write the president's essay on the conscience of the nation? I think that was Mike's. Again, he wouldn't own up to doing it. This is Chris's point. He would never. I told him at one point, if you write something else with someone else's name on it, I'll break your arm. It's just enough of that kind of thing. So then he went to DOJ when he was recruited to DOJ, to the Department of Justice at the time of Ford. He worked with Nino. He worked with Scalia. He had the task of shepherding through confirmation John Paul Stevens. He has that one. And then it was into private practice. He was at Pepper Hamilton with Ray, right? And made his way to Eagle. But then he made his way back to the academy. He was Terry O'Rourke. He had the right idea years ago when Claremont needed a president, and he said, "You ought to put your hat." I think it was a fine suggestion then. But Mike was stubborn. He would not go for it, and his elevation, his taking of that job to the college. I think it could have made a powerful difference for the college. I think Terry was right, but Mike was stubborn about it. But he's stubborn because he was clear on what he wanted to do. He wanted to teach. And let's pick up the story with the Claremont group, and of course you had some knowledge of Mike and his relations with Jim's brother, with Bill Buckley, didn't you?
Well, yes. I mean, I didn't really know him well until Mike came to Claremont,
Right.
which was
That's what I thought.
almost 20
Yeah.
years ago
Right,
now.
right.
As a full-time, as a teacher, and very soon a full-time teacher, which in some ways was his perhaps his real vocation or his ultimate vocation. Certainly, no one was as passionate or as good a teacher, I think, as he. But he was, I knew him, I guess I heard of him initially as in his years in defense, when he was defending the Electoral College. I think Ed Banfield told me the same thing. He told you I should read this report that he had written. And of course, Harry Jaffa was continually trying to get Mike to turn that into a book.
Constantly
Which,
prodding
and so
him. Yeah.
for 30 years, he had to listen to Harry Jaffa suggestions and his upbraiding of him.
Right.
Which, as you know, can be, those phone calls can
Yes,
be
yes.
inadequate.
Yes, I did a piece once dealing with our friend Bob Bork, and Harry wrote to me, he said, "It's anatomically impossible to kick a man in the backside and kiss him there at the same time." Yeah. Harry could be rough with those, but he was always prodding Mike to get that done, right?
That's right. That's right. And Mike's. We quickly became very close friends, though, and I must say that it is painful to be in Claremont now without him. The place just feels joyless in a certain way. I mean, even though we probably only saw each other once a month or something, it was wonderful to sort of know he was there. And if you wanted to join someone for, as Mike would say, a quick pop after work, not meaning soda, but a quick drink after work, he was game, and he was always a fantastic conversationalist as well. But he was one of Bill Buckley's boys. I mean, Mike
Right.
came of age in the conservative movement in the early 1960s out of Yale. And the conservative movement, as Mike used to say, in those days you could have had the convention of conservatives in a single phone booth, and that phone booth would have been close to Bill Buckley's office or his house, and he was obviously powerfully affected by Bill Buckley. He was a huge admirer of Buckley's, as I was, and there's a lot of young people in the 60s and even into the 70s were. And and one of the things about Mike is that he always was a living reminder in many ways of better times for the country and for the conservative movement and for the Catholic Church and for Western civilization in a way. I mean, he was an interesting combination of faith and reason, theory and practice, and sort of the pastoral and the dogmatic. And there was really no one else around who sort of had his uncanny ability to move from theory to practice and from talking about the way things should be to figuring out how we could help them to be as they should be, the reforms that were actually practicable. In that way, he had, in many ways, the sensibility of a founding father. Of someone who could move from what is right to what is practicable and back and forth as needed under the circumstances. A very rare skill in politics. There are plenty of dogmatists. There are plenty of people who maneuver from circumstance to circumstance, but very few who had his gift for incorporating the best of both the practical and the theoretical. And that was, it is true that it may be that the broadness of his portfolio encouraged a certain modesty in him, strangely enough. As Harry would tell him, and you, and anyone, for Aristotle, ambition is a virtue, the right amount of ambition.
Right.
And too much makes you a braggart, but too little, and that's a vice. But too little ambition is a vice too. It's not one you see that often, but especially in this city. But so Aristotle's complaint about people who lack the proper amount of ambition is they don't get a chance to show their qualities in public. They don't get a chance to use all of their character and their virtues. And I think even though, I understand the criticism of Mike for not pushing himself forward in so many ways and on so many occasions, I don't think that the actual reason behind that diagnosis really applies to him. He got a lot of things done, a lot of very good things done.
Yeah. Yeah.
He pushed himself forward. He pushed his causes forward quietly, prudently, like a Christian gentleman. And that strain of humility in him ran very deep, I think. And it could be aggravating, I understand, under certain circumstances, but it is so rare and it was so authentic in his soul that you really couldn't imagine him any other way, I think.
That's right. I think I said at one point that within the circle of Straussians and Jaffaites, he was probably the preeminent public man who we developed. He was schooled in natural law, and yet he lived in a world where the conservative political class was dismissive of it, and he had to function in that world and appreciate these people, and they would appreciate him in turn. He's also a voice of sobriety as you said. But I think he also had Lincoln's sense of the matter, that the first task of the statesman was to get clear on the nature of the regime he was trying to preserve, and then give people some way of talking about this thing in public. Remember Lincoln saying, slavery is we can't talk about slavery anywhere. We can't talk about it in the churches. It's too explosive, can't talk about it here. But Lincoln somehow managed to find a way of talking about it so that it made its way into the letters of those Civil War soldiers. And Mike had that sense of things. Now, I don't want to lose the thread here, but I realized as I took the thing over, I sort of skipped past. I don't want to get back to Ryan on working. A student said that Professor Uhlmann could read the telephone directory and make it interesting. Yeah. Right? But Ryan had some really lovely things to say. We're together in November about Mike as a teacher and Mike in the dissertation. But I moved very quickly, and I skipped the White House years, because I wanted Danny and Bill was really sweet enough to carve out the time to come on over to join us, and I want to take advantage of their presence. So let me call Dan and Bill to remember about Mike in the White House, those White House years.
Well, thank you. Hadley had asked me to talk about the White House, but I realize now that whatever tales I tell may either be contradicted or not denied by Boyden and Bill Barr. But I will plunge ahead anyway. Okay. I had known Michael way back through the various conservative networks in the 70s, but starting with the Reagan transition, where I was one of the people in the energy transition, and Michael seemed to be in the center of the hive of the legal and administrative matters. And the story I will tell, though, ties into his mischievous side as well, because one of the things that they were doing, which God knows should have been done by other Republican presidents, was to get the legal structures and powers right so that on day one you could undoubtedly at least put your people in place, or at least keep people you did not want in place, and the executive orders that they were ready to file. And I did not deal directly with it. I was doing energy, but you'd be around late at night. The transition headquarters, known as the Yummy Yogurt Building, the Reagan headquarters transition was over this building on M Street that had yummy yogurt on the ground floor. And Michael was drafting, and I came in at one point, and somebody else, under his leadership was drafting something, and Michael said, no, we have to begin it with something like, I, Ronaldus, by the grace of God, Reagan, leader of the United States and its empires and possessions beyond the seas, do hereby ordain and enact. I don't think that was the one that they ultimately did. I'm sure what was done was, as we knew there in the early days, were technically quite correct. But then, under Martin Anderson's leadership as the chief domestic policy advisor, 5 of us were chosen as assistant directors. I was energy and resources, Michael was legal, Bob Carlson, Roger Porter, John McClory, and that was the way that we functioned in deregulating items as they spoke about that administrative order. I was behind, or at least doing some of the work on deregulating oil, which we did. But each of us, as our privilege, besides our giant offices in the old EOB, was allowed to hire one younger person, a person of no note who would come along. Michael had this fellow named Bill Barr, who was his. Something happened to him. That also ties to Michael's bringing along people, both for their talents and what they knew of him, because when he was, to go backwards, Assistant Attorney General, there was a young person there under him who has said in public that he never said anything, this person, because there was Scalia, there was Bork, there was Larry Silberman, there was Mike Uhlmann. That was a fellow named Mitch McConnell. I've never quite figured out what became of him either. But people who were brought along in Mike's wake, like a great whale with minnows coming along behind them. But some of those minnows have grown up to be whales as well. So those were the main things directly from the White House years. If I can be given one more
Sure, go,
moment.
Dan, go.
Michael and I obviously stayed in touch a good bit after that. Michael's mind was completely organized. My impression is that his papers were not always as much so. And
It was sort of like the Bermuda Triangle.
I certainly hope, however, that those papers will get a good home in Claremont or in somewhere.
If we can find them, yeah.
I hope they're there, because my story is the last conversation I had with Michael was that I had written this dissent in Grutter, the affirmative action racial discrimination case, which I hope I went in the same direction as Justice Thomas's famous dissent. But in my piece, I had made a reference to one of the evils of racial discrimination in university admissions was deciding who was minority enough.
Right.
And I made a reference to having had a Christmas card from friends with a person and their descendants, and who was minority enough to be given preference. And Michael asked for that on the absolute promise that he would instantly return it. And these were the days before scanning and emails. Yeah. And he used it, I think, never returned it. If there's an eagle-eyed archivist somewhere that finds that, I would like the return. But during those periods, Michael's work in the White House in his area, which others have already encountered, was certainly an inspiration to us. As Chris noted, that second floor of the old DOB, which had the Vice President's office, the OMB Director's office, and our Policy Development office. Our conference room was where Cordell Hull had met the Japanese ambassadors the day of Pearl Harbor. I sometimes wondered whether that had any messages for us, but we did feel the historical weight, and Mike carried it forward wonderfully.
And Dan, what do they call the help? Sherpas? They call them Sherpas?
Well, the Sherpas were the people for summits, that when there was a foreign policy summit, when Nixon was going to meet Brezhnev or Reagan was going to meet Gorbachev, the Sherpas were the State Department and the national security people, Richard Allen, in the early days.
So when Bill was called in for working with Mike,
Sherpa?
what was that called? What was that called? Bill, take over this then.
As one of those whales. I saw a number of people laughing over there when you said these minnows grow into whales. I get a lot of jokes about that nowadays, but a couple of the themes here really struck home. The one about Mike being a mentor. I had been in the CIA. I went to law school at night. And then I was clerking for Judge Malcolm Wilkie on the D.C. Circuit.
Wow, sure.
And he took me to a conference. I can't remember what the conference was about, but on the margins of the conference, I think it was outside. He may have been smoking at that point. But I met Mike. The judge introduced me to him and told me he had been at the Justice Department. And I was interested eventually in going into government, and so we struck up a friendship, and I stayed in contact with him. And a couple of years later, he called up and said that he was going to the White House and wondered if I could join him to assist him. So we were called something like, what was it, deputy assistant to the something or other counselor, assistant director. So I helped on legal matters, and it was a real education for me, because that's where I learned about the Constitution, sitting on Mike's couch.
What kinds of things were you working on, Bill, at the time? Do you remember?
It was a potpourri of things, everything from tuition tax credits to the law of the sea to regulatory issues and things, whatever Mike didn't want to work on, which meant go ahead. Yeah. Now, something Justice Thomas said also struck home, which is him deciding what's the best occupation for you and the best way to spend your career. He did teach me that in government, people are everything, getting the right people into the right positions. And I left and I went back to my law firm. And I left the White House, went back to my law firm to make partner because I'm a very pragmatic, very practical person. I was loving my time at the White House, meeting people, working with and meeting people like Danny and working with Boyden and many others. Larry Kudlow and I, who spend a lot of time together now, was right across the hall from me in those days. We call ourselves the old Reaganites in this administration. But I then went and worked in the Bush camp, the Bush transition, and Mike said, and I was frankly looking for a job in the administration, having spent a few years at a law firm, that would give me some expertise so I could actually make money and become a rainmaker in a law firm. So I was looking around for something that sort of had commercial application, and Mike said, Office of Legal Counsel, that's what you're going to do. And I said, look, I mean, that's for people who want to be Supreme Court justices, and I don't want to be, I don't want to be a judge, I don't want to be a law professor. I want to go and, he said, no, Office of Legal Counsel. It's decided, I talked to Boyden, you're going over. And, that really helped launch me at the Department of Justice, and actually, the same thing happened when I left the Department of Justice, and I had some offers from some companies, and he said, "Go to GTE, telecommunications. Telecommunications is." So he's, at each important juncture, he decided where I fit in the scheme of things. So I owe him a lot.
It's your choice, and this is it. It's your choice, and this is it.
This one here, yeah.
Well,
I just say that, the other thing is his humility and his not pushing himself forward, because at the same time he was telling me that I had to be OLC. Right. He was offered the associate position at the Department of Justice, and I thought he should go to the Department of Justice, serve as associate, and he didn't really pursue it. Had he done that, we fired our deputy a number of times. He would have ended up as deputy, and then who knows what after that. So, anyway.
You mentioned a long while ago to me, years ago, that you had a judicial post you wanted to try to talk him into.
Yeah.
Which one was that?
I think it was the D.C. Circuit.
Wow, okay.
But he would not be talked into it.
No. I told Mike was the voice of sobriety. The first conversation I had with him, I think, I was on the short list to write for Reagan in the first administration. I'd written some of the best things Ronald Reagan had never said. With Tony Dolan. And Mike explained to me, look, it's not, writing speeches, it's not always Churchillian. It may be a paragraph for the urologists who are in town. Now look, I do want to go back to the people who are great, his fine students. I want to bring Ryan and Matt into the conversation. Ryan, let's start with you about your sense of him doing the dissertation. But anyway, your own reflections about Mike as a teacher.
Yeah, well, I had the privilege of becoming his colleague and friend as well. But my first interactions with Mike was as a teacher, and as you said, Hadley, he's a wonderfully gifted lecturer. Made it look very easy. He rarely had any notes, maybe a few scribbled things, but the lecture was organized in his head. And he, given off his practical experience, had this wonderful ability to adorn teachings about deeper things with wonderful anecdotes. And my favorite, because it always was followed by him laughing and snorting at his own story, is he loved to tell the story of the planning for Grenada and all the senior military brasses in the room, and they were going through what to do. And then at one point, President Reagan asks, well, what's the weather like in Grenada? And the senior guys sort of look at each other, and nobody really knows. And as Mike said, then some bird colonel down way at the end of the table said, 75 degrees and sunny, sir. And it was a way of Mike pointing out that we shouldn't think too highly too often of expertise. And he also implied that colonel probably didn't know what the hell he was talking about, but it didn't really matter. Sometimes you have to just take the initiative.
But he had something to say.
Yeah, and he was a warm, as everyone who knew him knows, of course, a warm collector of friends and families, and with a bunch of fellow grad students. Some were married, some were not, and he had this earthy Catholic sense of humor. You'd get married and he'd be very happy for you, and then he'd say, "So, expecting any children?" And when somebody said no, he'd say, if you are curious about how that all works, we have videos that we can and of course, and then he had despite his last name, he had an Irish Catholic sense of the healing properties of whiskey. He'd recommend it often. Two particular instances, which I always find amusing. I'd finished qualifying exams, 6-hour written exam, 2 subfields. You prepare for months, and I saw him outside of it, and of course he grades the things blind with others, so you're not supposed to really talk about your answers. But he said, "Don't tell me anything. I don't want to know. Just go get drunk." That was his instruction. And then I'm happily married now. We have a 13-month-old, but I did at one point have a busted engagement, and Uhlmann's advice was, "Well, Ryan, this is why the good Lord invented whiskey." It was sound advice.
Was that your experience, Matt?
As an undergraduate, we drank a lot of cheap beer, and before I moved to Washington, he did tell me you have to learn to drink something a little better than that. And he had plenty of suggestions, but I think I came into Mike Uhlmann's orbit somewhat by happenstance. At Claremont McKenna, you sort of took a full complement of classes, and then when the next term started, you could add an extra course called overloading, I think is what the term was. And I always had the philosophy that you pay the same amount whether you're taking 20 credits or 12, so why not take 20 to get your money's worth? So I would go to the bookstore and look at the books by course, and I spotted a course that had really fascinating books, and I leaned forward, and it was a graduate course, the judiciary or the judicial process. Ryan was in the class, and it was some Professor Uhlmann, and I thought, who's that? And I went home and I looked him up, and he'd written a book on assisted suicide, and he'd been in the Ford administration, and I didn't really know, so I sent him an email, and he told me, "You're an undergrad, you're welcome to take my course, but we'll have a meeting in my office, and then we'll get coffee beforehand." So I traipsed up, sort of uphill to Claremont Graduate University from Claremont McKenna, and I sat down in his office, and there were papers on the table and papers on the floor and books everywhere. He sort of had to move a stack so that he could see me.
But he knew where it was.
That's true. That absolutely.
He knew where it was.
At varying times, he did get up and sort of lift a stack and hand me an article, like, "You should read this before the class starts." But he was very welcoming and encouraging, and he asked all about me and my life. And at some point, a custodian came in to take the garbage. And he got up and he greeted the custodian by name, and it was, just after the break, he said, "How was your break? How was your son and your wife?" And he knew the gentleman, and he knew all about the gentleman's life, and I was really impressed by his warmth. And we went down to get coffee in the cafeteria, and the same thing happened. He knew every member of the cafeteria staff. If we'd been on break, he came in and he greeted each one, and he shook their hand and asked, "How's your youngest enjoying high school? And how's, And they were all so happy, and I thought, this is the kind of person I want to study with. Not just that he knew so much, and so that's how he was in the classroom. I do have to say the experience was a little different in the undergrad classes than say in the graduate school classes. The graduate students at Claremont are older, obviously more mature. They know a lot, but they're at Claremont because they know they want to learn from Straussians. They're there to learn from Professor Kesler and learn from Professor Uhlmann. The undergrads make their way to Claremont McKenna, I think largely because you had high SATs, good grades, and you liked sunny weather and free beer. So, his teaching style would adjust, and in the undergraduate classes, you'd have, Professor Michael Uhlmann talking about the Constitution or talking about the administrative state with students who were really interested in the subject. They had strong opinions about the subject. They were entirely ignorant of the subject. And they had no idea they were ignorant of the subject. And they largely didn't agree with his views. So he would temper himself, and he played devil's advocate in the undergraduate classes. And I don't want to talk for too long, but I can remember him teaching the slaughterhouse cases, and he taught Justice Miller's majority and Justice Field's dissent, and we'd read a little bit of Richard Epstein and a little bit of Randy Barnett, so I just naturally assumed, clearly Professor Uhlmann is going to say this gutted privileges and immunities, this was the worst thing. And in the course of the hour and 15-minute lecture, he must have taken different positions 8 times. I must have changed my mind 8 times. I'm still a little confused about the slaughterhouse cases. And he told us we had to write a paper on it afterwards. And so I was going through my old emails with him, and I had sent him an email saying, I'm really not sure what to say about the slaughterhouse cases. Can I look at outside sources? He had an amazing way of bringing the material to life and endearing himself to students that might not have disagreed. He taught, all of the hot topic cases that were going through. He taught the partial birth abortion cases, which were, things that were very near and dear to his heart. But he taught them so neutrally and with so much compassion, and he would always press you, well, think about this other person, and how does your doctrine affect their life? And it was amazing the way he was able to mold us. Yeah.
You touched, I hope you came down to Stephen Field's side in an opinion.
More or less.
Okay. But you touched the key issue that was central to Mike's concerns, and that was the life issues, the human person, as John Paul II put it, the bearer of human rights and the claim to protection of the law. And Mike was actually in the pro-life movement before Roe versus Wade. And I remember I saw Mike on television in 1967 doing a trial where he interviewed Mildred Jefferson. And the governor of California, Ronald Reagan, saw that interview. It was Mildred Jefferson was a black woman who graduated from the Harvard Medical School in 1945. Very impressive gal. She got a call from Reagan. And Mike said, I want you to invent a reason for going out to California. And let the governor know. And then you'll be invited over for discussion. You do touch one of Mike's favorite stories. I can't resist telling about that. That's one of our favorite characters in the pro-life movement, McCarthy Demers, who was a surgeon. He took care of General MacArthur. He's a surgeon and a lawyer. The line was, if McCarthy couldn't save you, he'd write the will. And he's from Memphis. And the situation, it's a pro-life meeting in Detroit, fall of 1977. And McCarthy is on. And as usual in a pro-life meeting, there's a baby crying in the audience. And that stops him, and he says, so that Tennessee drawl, that young one I'm away from home for a while. The young one makes me quite homesick. I got 5 back home. 6 years old to 17. But it's that 5th one, the youngest one, we worry about. Because the statistics show that every 5th child born into this world turns out to be a Chinese communist. Well, okay. Just to give you a sense of the world in which Mike and I lived, let me finish with this. This is for Susanna. When Mike was at the Bradley Foundation, he had a marvelous secretary. I can't recall her name, but I'd say, I just go into Mike's office and speak these lines. The lines were from Hamlet. So she'd go in and say, I could a tale unfold whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul, freeze thy young blood, make thy 2 eyes like stars start from their spheres. And I knew once she said it, he couldn't control himself. It was the ghost speech in Hamlet. and it would all come out. He just couldn't resist himself. So it'd be, I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night. We have him on recording of Mike doing this in the session. I'm doomed to a certain time to work the night, and for the day confined to fast in fires till the foul crime is done in my day of nature, are burned and purged away. He says, there I was sleeping by brother's hand, of life, of crown, of queen at once dispatched, cut off even in the blossoms of my sin, unhoused, disappointed, unhandled, no reckoning made, but sent to my account with all my imperfections on my head. That's how he would end it. It was very moving. He couldn't resist himself. We have a recording of Mike doing that in the session we did with Ed Gero on playing Nino. I'm playing Nino Scalia. Well, what's that old line of Christopher Wren's? If you seek his monuments, look about you. He left us grand memories and instructions and wise counsel, but he also left us the gifts of Rachel and Peter and Becky and Jenny and Sarah. And I'm so touched to see them, have them with us today. So as Tiny Tim said, God bless us one and all. Right? Thanks all for coming.